instantly claiming central real estate. This opens lines for development and stakes a claim on key squares. Developing the knight to f6 immediately contests the center and prepares for potential pawn advances. Unpinning the knight strategically initiates development and eye on the f6 square. Asserting central space. Black immediately contests white's pawn structure, aiming to free their pieces and ignite counterplay. Solidifying the central pawn and offering support for the knight. This retreat prepares for a queenside expansion and generally simplifies the position by avoiding immediate confrontation. Challenging the center immediately. This pawn thrust disrupts white's pawn structure and opens diagonals for the queen and bishops. Exchanging the bishop here lightens black's queenside pawns, potentially creating an endgame advantage through doubled weaknesses. Opening the g-file so drastically compromises the king's safety. Anticipate an onslaught. Opening the center immediately for pawn dominance, but it sacrifices piece harmony. Unlocking the e-file and reinforcing the queenside. Black embraces a more dynamic pawn structure, albeit at the cost of some structural weaknesses. Controlling the center with pawns. White establishes a powerful pawn chain, aiming to restrict black's piece mobility and prepare a kingside assault. Clearing that central pawn opens up diagonal lines for white's bishop and queen, immediately creating pressure along the c-file and the long diagonal. Black must now be hyper-vigilant about pawn structure weaknesses, especially the isolated c-pawn, and the potential for white's pieces to infiltrate. This position demands active defense and careful piece placement to counter white's emerging initiative. Forces the black king's shield to crumble. White is now sacrificing pawn structure for tempo and an open diagonal aimed squarely at the weakened kingside, creating immediate attacking chances. Developing the knight to the center. This move prepares to castle and fights for central squares, a crucial step in navigating the opening's inherent complexity. Unlocking the central tension. That queen exchange sacrifices immediate material gain for a potent open diagonal aimed squarely at black's exposed king. White decisively seizes initiative, forcing a structural concession from black with that doubled pawn. Unlocking lines and developing active piece play immediately becomes paramount after that capture. The queen's foray into enemy territory forces a crucial decision regarding king safety, potentially creating weaknesses around the white monarch while simultaneously demanding a careful retreat to avoid further material loss. Developing the knight to c3 shores up your central pawns and prepares for kingside castling, a prudent step given the open diagonals black has created. This move also positions the knight to potentially influence squares like e4 or d5 later on, adding tactical flexibility. You're building a solid foundation while keeping options open for future maneuvers. Black recaptures, resolving the immediate pawn deficit but creating doubled pawns on the f-file. This positional concession might allow white greater central influence later, as the queen now becomes a target. Fortifying the central pawns and preparing to contest the open files. Nf3 now aims to liberate the kingside and begin developing the remaining pieces towards the heart of the board, potentially creating threats against black's slightly compromised pawn structure. Capturing the queen, while seemingly forceful, relinquishes black's structural advantage gained by forcing the exchange. The immediate aftermath reveals a more open board, offering white increased piece activity and potential attacking avenues down the central files that black may struggle to control effectively in the coming skirmishes. Unburdening the queen from its defensive duties and centralizing the bishop now aims to exploit black's awkwardly placed pawns and potentially weak light squares. Developing the bishop to d7 solidifies black's queenside structure, preparing to castle and connect the rooks, while also offering a potential defender for the pawn on c4 should white attempt further pressure in that sector, initiating the king's march from its cozy, yet potentially exposed, starting square. This move signals white's intent to activate their monarch into the upcoming middle game fray, potentially eyeing central squares or even the kingside for shelter. Securing the open c-file with the rook is a vital step, immediately challenging white's control and preparing to contest this crucial pathway for the remainder of the game, asserting dominion over the open files. This move proactively prepares to challenge black's central control and potentially exploit weaknesses on the queenside. Emerging from the tactical skirmish, black seeks to solidify their position by developing the bishop to a square that offers some central influence and prepares for eventual castling, though the kingside structure remains somewhat compromised from the earlier pawn exchanges. Developing the rook to the open file aims to contest control and prepare for potential advances, but it sacrifices the immediate coordination offered by keeping the king safer for now. Injecting a dynamic pawn thrust into the center, f5 seeks to break white's central grip and potentially open lines for black's pieces. A bold maneuver to counter white's coordinated pieces and claim more active play, instantly diverting attention to the queenside. This maneuver probes for weaknesses and potentially isolates black's pieces from their defensive duties, unleashing the knight to flank the queenside. This maneuver creates immediate pressure on the white queen and knight coordination, seeking to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially exploit the open c-file. Focusing the bishop towards the queenside's active squares, preparing to potentially contest the semi-open c-file or support a pawn push that opens lines for the rooks. Clearing the rook from the first rank, black prepares to activate the other. The rook settles onto the open file, a classic power play that instantly stakes a claim in the heart of the board and intensifies the struggle for central control, setting the stage for potential piece activity and a deeper positional squeeze. Reclaiming the initiative, black re-establishes development after the series of exchanges, eyeing the central files and preparing to contest the d-file. White's knight boldly advances, immediately eyeing the weak squares around black's castled king while simultaneously reinforcing the central d-pawn and preparing to join the fight for kingside initiative. Exchanging knights on d4 offers white the clear advantage of opening a path for their rook to the now unprotected c-file, directly challenging black's control there and promising increased pressure. Sacrificing the knight here unwinds the pawn structure significantly, opening lines that will become crucial. The knight's departure transforms the central pawn majority into a double-edged sword for black, potentially creating weaknesses on the dark squares while offering a dynamic outlet for piece activity. Consider how this exchange impacts the long-term fight for central space and whether black's queen can effectively redeploy to exploit the resulting open files, establishing a solid defensive outpost for the bishop. This maneuver aims to secure the f5 pawn and prepare for potential central expansion or a kingside build-up, while also offering a retreat square should the knight on c6 advance, prying open the diagonal to bishop's influence. This repositioning aims to exploit potential weaknesses in black's pawn structure on the queenside and pressure the d6 bishop, hinting at a potential endgame advantage should pieces continue to be exchanged. Securing the monarch by shifting it away from the center's potential crossfire marks this maneuver, prioritizing immediate king safety over further central consolidation. Eliminating the bishop from the queenside opens the path for white's rooks to potentially dominate the open files, while simultaneously relinquishing the initiative in that sector. Black's king now faces increased scrutiny as a result of this exchange. The Black King's venturing out of its protective pawn shield signals a shift towards an immediate endgame battle, accepting the positional concession of a weakened pawn structure for the potential of active piece play in a more central king position. Securing the kingside structure with a timely pawn advance prepares for potential piece maneuvers and aims to liberate the bishop on g2. Gaining a bit of breathing room on the kingside can be a welcome development, as it often helps to secure the monarch from potential future harassment and may even open avenues for counterplay down the line. 23. Nf3 redirects your knight, seeking central influence and eyeing potential outposts on the queenside, while also preparing to support a pawn advance and consolidate your king's safety before black can exploit the open files. The rook's new home on g8 unlocks a potent diagonal, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and create immediate attacking chances if white's king remains in its somewhat exposed central position. Opening the d-file establishes a clear pathway for the rook, aiming to challenge black's control and potentially exploit the lightly defended kingside in the impending endgame. The king's journey to safety begins, a necessary prelude to the coming exchanges as the players eye the central files. And that rook on the c-file, now doubled, will soon exert immense pressure. Black's pawn structure on the kingside is a bit compromised, but for now, the immediate concern is consolidating development and preparing for counterplay as the queens depart the board and the endgame looms. Repositioning the rook to the fourth rank opens up the c-file for future possibilities, while also potentially creating a battery with the bishop on d3. Should it relocate, seeking to exploit the open files and perhaps create a discovered attack down the kingside. Black advances the rook, aiming to pressure white's beleaguered king and coordinate with the knight on the queenside. Relocating the pawn from the kingside edge aims to contest the imminent pawn advance and potentially disrupt black's coordinated pieces, preventing a further squeeze on white's queenside. Exchanging off that last defender of the d-file simplifies the structure, paving the way for a more active rook presence on the central open file, which might be a key to unlocking further advantages. Seizing the open file and centralizing the knight with decisive purpose, white reasserts control and begins the process of consolidating their material advantage. Unlocking the bishop's potential here by repositioning it to the active e5 square aims to provoke a reaction and potentially disrupt white's central pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing for increased activity on the kingside later on. Solidifying the king's central presence now becomes paramount, as the monarch navigates the open lines and potential endgame complications ahead. The black monarch, abandoning its relative safety, ventures into the thick of things. A bold but potentially precarious decision given the open nature of the board and the lurking white knight. The king, now an active participant, ventures towards the queenside, seeking to leverage its newfound mobility and influence the pawn structure on that flank. Securing the queenside by advancing the pawn to a6 is a pragmatic step, creating a vital outpost for the knight and simultaneously probing for weaknesses in white's otherwise solid pawn structure. Prying open that queenside pawn chain with the a-pawn aims to disrupt black's solid structure and potentially create a weakness to exploit later. A subtle maneuver to reposition the bishop, aiming to contest the central light squares and potentially offer more defensive support to the kingside should white's pieces become too active. Solidifying the pawn chain on the kingside now. This maneuver aims to create a more robust defensive structure, preventing any immediate infiltration by black's bishop or rook towards the king, while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances later in the game. Steering the bishop to g7 aims to activate this piece, freeing it from its current passive guard duty on d7 and preparing for potential infiltration or defense of the kingside, especially as white's knight now occupies the active d4 square. The advance of the b-pawn here aims to gain territory on the queenside, potentially creating a passed pawn later and restricting black's pieces, though it does weaken the queenside pawn structure. Exchanging the bishop for the knight here relinquishes black's last active piece, solidifying white's pawn structure and preparing a decisive central push with the king. Embracing the endgame's stark realities, the king steps into the fray, an audacious act transforming white's monarch into an active participant rather than a passive observer, directly challenging black's consolidated pawn structure and preparing to exploit potential weaknesses in the upcoming skirmishes. Fleshing out the pawn structure on the queenside aims to secure a foothold for your pieces and potentially create counterplay. Opening the A-file dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating immediate attacking potential against black's vulnerable king on d6, while also potentially isolating the b5 pawn as an advanced threat. Embracing the open file, black capitalizes on the newly minted horizontal expanse, initiating a forceful penetration. This maneuver dramatically alters the positional landscape, aiming to disrupt white's hitherto solid pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the king. Unlocking the central diagonal with pawn thrust aims to disrupt black's carefully constructed defensive pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside for white. Gaining initiative by forcing the white king to reposition, this aggressive thrust disrupts white's unified pawn structure and opens avenues for black's pieces to become more active. The king boldly strides into the fray, seeking safety amidst the approaching pawn storm while simultaneously reinforcing the central pawn chain, opening the center with a pawn thrust. This decision fundamentally alters the pawn structure and king safety dynamics. The king bravely ventures into the center, a daring gambit to reclaim central influence and activate its dormant power in this evolving endgame landscape. The king finally decides to venture out from its defensive shell, aiming to support its pawn structure and influence the center. Unleashing the kingside pawns now is a key step towards activating that rook and potentially creating a passed pawn on the kingside. That pawn push lunges forward, immediately challenging the opposing king's sanctuary and opening a vital pathway for the black monarch to become more active in this late-stage struggle. The monarch retreats, creating a safe haven while maintaining the crucial central presence. The black king, having ventured out, now faces a precarious position with the white pawn on e4 ready to advance and white's pieces poised to exploit its exposed location. Consolidating the monarch at d3 repositions the king to a more central and defensible square, a crucial step as the pawn structure becomes increasingly simplified. Igniting a desperate counterplay, the pawn surges forward, seeking to disrupt white's consolidated king position and potentially open diagonals for the bishop. The pawn push, a decisive step, now forces the king's hand, a pivotal moment in this endgame where the control of the central squares is paramount. The king finally ventures out, a daring maneuver to escape the pawn chains and become an active participant in the endgame's unfolding drama. The monarch is finally repositioned, preparing to support the pawn advance and contest the central squares. The king, now an active participant, boldly strides towards the center, aiming to leverage its newfound mobility in this simplified pawn structure. Consolidating the monarch's safety is paramount as the pawn structure simplifies. Pushing the king forward now opens up lines for potential piece activity, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps exploit the rather exposed f3 pawn in the near future. Consolidating the king's position becomes paramount here, seeking a more secure square to weather black's looming pawn advances and potential mating threats. The black king, after a long journey, finally finds a safer haven, escaping the e-file's potential pressures and seeking refuge amongst its own pawns. A bold recapture, liberating your king and opening lines for a potential attack against the exposed black monarch. Capturing the pawn on g3 opens up critical lines towards the white king and introduces a dynamic imbalance, forcing white to defend with immediate tactical awareness. The monarch ventures out to contest the central squares, initiating a race against the opposing king for crucial territory. Capturing the pawn on h4 offers a temporary material gain, but it significantly exposes the black king to the advancing white pawns and relinquishes any hope of creating a passed pawn on the kingside. The monarch consolidates its position, aiming to support the pawn majority on the kingside. This king, exposed and desperately seeking refuge on the edge of the board, now finds itself a tempting target, a beacon for the remaining enemy forces to converge upon and dismantle any lingering hope of safety. The monarch regains its central hub, aiming to solidify the kingside defense and prepare for a potential king march towards the queenside. A crucial maneuver in this highly simplified yet tense position. The advance of this pawn to the 6th rank, while seemingly minor, attempts to create a pawn passed on the kingside, a common endgame goal. However, it also opens a diagonal for the enemy king to potentially infiltrate and exploit the pawn structure's weaknesses. A significant positional compromise given black's king currently occupies a relatively safe square. Seeking to consolidate your king's safety, the logical step is to advance it, aiming for a more secure central square. Pushing the king forward to h4 creates a dynamic imbalance, offering a chance to push the isolated h-pawn and create a passed threat. But it also exposes your monarch to potential counterplay down the g-file if white can consolidate. Securing the king's dominion by advancing it to g2 begins the careful choreography of pushing this pawn advantage, aiming to exploit the exposed enemy monarch. Pushing your king into the fray at this juncture, while seemingly aggressive, exposes it to potential traps and allows white's monarch to consolidate its position more effectively, essentially giving up the central initiative for a pawn grab that might prove costly in the long run.